because in 1989 you'll remember that the Tiananmen Square and the communistic government in China put down a demonstration of over 1 million students and killed thousands of them. And that was 1989. 1989 is also the time when Solidarity ousted the Communistic Party in Poland. And from Poland, communism fell in practically every Eastern Europe country, except Romania. And you remember in Romania that the Stalinist leader, Ceausescu, was shot on December 25, 1989. That's it, just keep up a bit further. There's Ceausescu, his grave. Then in 1989, you'll remember, something else happened. The Berlin Wall fell. And this was the year also when John Paul II believed that the Virgin Mary helped them to overcome communism in Europe. Now, they're all very deeply significant dates and events, aren't they? 1989. But 1989 is not the year that changed the modern world. Would you say, what about September 11? Yes, that was a significant event too, but it didn't change the modern world. Life went on much the same after September 11 as it did before. I'm going to suggest to you the year that changed the modern world is 1844. And I'm going to prove that to you now. I'm going to give you the evidence of that. That's a big statement to make, but I want to give you the evidence now. Would you open your Bibles to Daniel chapter 8? And I just want to give you a little bit of a background. I'm not going to go through the prophecy of Daniel 8 because we haven't got time to do that, but I do want just to read a few verses to give you the background. Daniel chapter 8 and verse 12. Daniel chapter 8 and verse 12. It says, because of transgression, an army was given over to the horn to oppose the daily sacrifices, and he cast truth to the ground. He did all this and prospered. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to the certain one who was speaking, how long will the vision be concerning the daily sacrifices and the transgression of desolation, to give both the sanctuary and the host to be trodden underfoot? And he said unto me, for 2,300 days, then the sanctuary will be cleansed. Now that's the background, biblical background to 1844. And as I said, I haven't got time, and it's not my purpose this morning to go through that. There's lots of material that you can read on that. But what I am interested in these verses is the fact that there are two things that Daniel 8 verse 13 says are going to be downgraded. What are they? In fact, it uses the word trodden underfoot. What is the word? If you trod something underfoot, what does that mean? Have you got a high regard for something you're treading underfoot? No. And what are the two things that are being trodden underfoot according to this verse? The truth, and what else? The sanctuary, isn't that right? The truth and the sanctuary. And something was going to happen at the end of the 2,300 days, or prophetic days or years, which was going to restore truth and the sanctuary. We believe that that was 1844. We have noticed, and I'm sure you have in your study of the Bible, whenever God has a truth, what does the devil always do? Counterfeit it. You can't name me a single truth in the Bible that I can't show you that it's been counterfeited in the world. Doesn't matter where you look, whether it's baptism, the Sabbath, state of the dead, go through the lot. Every last one of them has been counterfeited to take people's attention away from the truth. And so we are going to notice now as we go through that some very significant things happened in 1844. Very significant. You will remember that on this particular day, 178 years ago, Christians from all denominations, the Baptists, the Pentecostals, the Methodists, the Presbyterians, the Catholics, Anglicans, you name them, they all believed that Jesus was going to come back to the earth in October 22, 1844. Now, I want you to understand something very clearly. No Seventh-day Adventist has ever set a date for the coming of Jesus. The people who set the date for the coming of Jesus were the Baptists and the Methodists and the Anglicans and the Catholics. They were the ones that set the date for the coming of Jesus. Seventh-day Adventists have never, ever set a date for the coming of Jesus. In fact, there were no Seventh-day Adventists in existence at that particular time. So we must always remember that, because often our opponents will try to say that we are the ones that set the date for the coming of Jesus. That is not true. And it ended in a disappointment. You can just imagine those poor people. I've often thought about them, you know. How devastated they must have felt. If you really believed that Jesus was coming today and he didn't come back, wouldn't you be so devastated? And they were. They were discouraged, they were disappointed and despondent. And many people gave up their faith in the Bible and God. They said the whole thing is a hoax. Others then ridiculed those who wanted to hang on to the Bible and believe in God. But there was a group among them who said, look, the Bible's not wrong. It must be our misunderstanding of the Bible. That's the reason why something has happened that we didn't understand. And so what they did, 4 years later, in the year 1848, these sincere people, the ones who still believed in the Bible and God, they said, look, the Bible's not wrong. God is still on his throne. There must be something wrong. And they began to study the Bible. They call themselves the Sabbath conferences. And these people were all made up of these different denominations. Sincere, good people. And they worked out a theology in those Sabbath conferences that resurrected and restored truths that had been trodden down for a long, long time. I believe God was in that movement, in those Sabbath conferences. And I want to put on the screen the 5 great pillars that were worked out in that Sabbath conference. The first one was the sanctuary doctrine. This is where the Sabbath, or the sanctuary, was understood. They studied it and they began to understand that Jesus was ministering in the heavenly sanctuary. It wasn't him coming back to this earth. And so the sanctuary was born, and Jesus was ministering in the heavenly sanctuary. Following the sanctuary, the second great pillar was the second advent. They believed that Jesus was going to come back to this earth. They still believe that, even though they had been mistaken in 1844. And the same conference, they worked out and studied the Sabbath. This is where the Sabbath was restored. None of these truths were new truths. They just studied them and found that these truths had been lost sight of. They had been trodden down, as the Bible said. And so the Sabbath was restored. And then the state of the dead. Man's soul sleep. They rediscovered that great truth. And then finally, the spirit of prophecy. Now, it's these 5 pillars that are the basis of Seventh-day Adventism. You cannot be a Seventh-day Adventist unless you believe in those 5 points. They're the pillars of what Seventh-day Adventism is about, because it was out of the Sabbath conference that the church finally arose. As these sincere people of all these denominations studied these things out, and it took them a long time. It wasn't just a weekend. Many, many hours of study. And out of that was born the Seventh-day Adventist Church. So, and it is some of these, unfortunately, some of these pillars that some of the people in the church today want to downplay, particularly the last one, the spirit of prophecy. And I meet youth sometimes who feel embarrassed that we have a prophetess. But then as those youth are converted and they understand, they become a tremendous power in the church. Tremendous power. And I am so encouraged as I go around and see many of our youth today who are understanding this. They're getting hold of it. And remember, most of the people in this group of Sabbath conferences were young people. There weren't too many grey hairs among them. We tend to sometimes associate the church with grey hairs. But that's not the way the church began. It began with youth. Ellen White was 17 in the early part when she received her first vision. 17. And so this message, in the context of the sanctuary and the final judgment, the hour of God's judgment, took place. Now, do you think the devil was happy about the Sabbath conferences? No, not at all. In fact, just come back over to Revelation 12 and you'll notice that, the devil is a great believer. What I like to remember is the devil is no liberal. He's not even a progressive Adventist, whatever that means. He's certainly not a liberal, because it says that the devil believes in what? Trembles. He believes it. He knows that it's true. If anyone in the universe is convinced that God exists, it's the devil. That's why he's doing everything in his power to distract. Revelation 12:17 says the dragon was wroth with the woman and went to make war with the rest of her offspring. The old version says the remnant, who keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. So does that suggest to you that the devil is happy with a group of people who want to follow Christ and keep his commandments and have the testimony of Jesus or the spirit of prophecy? Does that mean that the devil's happy? Absolutely not. The very opposite. He hates it. This message is so simple and so clear. I just find it very difficult to understand how anyone can stumble over the Adventist message. It is just so simple and so clear. Those messages in Revelation chapter 14, where it talks there about worshipping God and give glory to him, and worshipping him as the creator, and keeping the commandments, and following Jesus. How simple is that? You can't argue with it. It's just as simple as ABC. And the devil knew that. So the devil began to call his imps, his angels, and talk to them about, we need to develop some strategies in order to counter the three messages of Revelation 14. So they came up with some strategies. The first strategy they came up with was an opposing theology. That is, there's the message, well, we'll oppose it. Every aspect of it, we'll come up with an opposition to it. And they accepted that and they said, yeah, that's okay. But the devil said, look, That's not going to be sufficient, because there are going to be people who study the Bible carefully and they'll see the difference between the truth and the error. So they worked out and said, well, we will have to come up with other strategies in order to oppose truth. And so the next strategy they came up with was to pervert truth. Now, this was extremely successful with Christians. But again, they realised that perverting the truth doesn't trap everybody, because those who are sincere and really study the Bible and have a relationship with God, they'll soon see the difference between the perverted truth and the truth. So the devil and his angels realised that that wasn't going to be finally sufficient. The third strategy that he came up with was to create a lukewarmness among those who are supposed to be preaching the message. That was very successful. Oh, they believe it. Of course we believe it. But they live as if the Lord's never going to come back. Their attention is really this earth. Well, I want to have a look at some of these strategies because they're very interesting. At the Sabbath conferences, they took a position, and the position was this: we believe in the Bible and the Bible only. Have you heard that? Yes, that's the basis of Adventism. The Bible and the Bible only. That's where it comes from the Sabbath conferences. Now, what's the year that we are saying that's significant? 1844. Do you know, on August 1844, that very year, August 1844, a man by the name of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, there they are. They met in Paris, and they went to a cafe, and on November 19, 1844, Engels wrote to Marx this, and I'm going to read it to you what he wrote. We are at present holding public meetings all over the place to set up societies for the advancement of the workers. By a large majority, everything Christian was banned from the rules. Then they went on to say, the criticism of religion is the prerequisite of all criticism, and we are working for the abolition of religion and for real happiness. That happened in 1844, the very year when God's message was to worship God as the Creator. Here, Engels and Marx worked out a philosophy that was going to appeal to the workers, and it was going to downgrade God. Everything about God and religion was to be banished. So, as he said, this will bring the world into happiness. So that would suggest to me that any group, any place in the world today that has accepted Marxist theology and his ideology would be a place of happiness. China, place of happiness. North Korea, a place of happiness. Russia, a place of happiness. Is that true? Absolutely not. The very opposite. But the devil realised that that's not going to appeal to everybody either. And you're beginning to see that what the devil's doing is bringing in strategies that are going to appeal to the whole nation, but he realised that one strategy will never appeal to everybody. So he will use a variety of strategies, because the devil doesn't mind what you believe as long as you don't believe the truth. And he wanted to get after now the intellectuals. So, in 1844, a man by the name of Charles Darwin, have you ever heard of him? Wrote an essay, and he sent it out to all his intellectual mates for their comment, and that was the beginning of the origin of species. It came about in 1844. And how much of the world has been knocked by that philosophy. Just about every university, every high school is teaching a derivative of Darwin's philosophy, isn't that right? I must say, I find it very difficult to understand how an intellectual person can believe in the theory of evolution. Really, I do. To think that they believe that everything came from nothing is just absurd. The Dawkins and the Hawkins of this world, who were originally the heads of Oxford and Cambridge universities in the science department, physics. Of course, Hawkins has since died. He was the man, remember, sitting in the chair? He has died. But the other man is still alive. And they formed together what is called the Brights. That's what they named their society, the Brights. Which the implication is that if you believe in the supernatural, you're not bright. In fact, Richard Dawkins, and you can see the statement on the screen, made this absurd statement. And the absurd statement is, he said that he believed that, he said, God almost certainly does not exist. Now, do you think that's an absurd statement? You think about that, stupid. And he's supposed to be an intellectual, making a stupid statement like that makes no sense. God almost certainly does not exist. Yes. But that's what he said. And we need a date. 1844. A man by the name, because now the devil wanted to get after the religious people. And so he moved upon a man by the name of John Nelson Darby. And he came up with what is known today in the Christian world as dispensationalism. And dispensationalism means that the world is divided into 7 different periods. We happen to be living at the present time in the church period. But very soon, before the tribulation takes place, the church is going to be raptured away, and then God is going to concentrate on the Jews, Israel. Now, this is dispensationalism in our current environment. They believe in another 5 dispensations or periods of Earth's history. Now, unfortunately, that spread through the churches like a wildfire. And now we've got to correct that mess. If ever you have people come along to our meetings and we start to get to know people, often they have been influenced and have accepted the idea of the secret rapture. Heard that? That's all part of dispensationalism. And it takes a tremendous amount, often of energy and time, to help people to understand the mess that has created. And unfortunately, J.N. Darby, that did not originate with him. It actually originated with the Jesuits, with a man by the name of Manuel Lacunza. Now, Manuel Lacunza lived between the years 1731 and he died in 1801. He was born in Chile, and as a young, converted, he was a converted Jew, and he took the name, the synonym for name, Ben Ezra. And he wrote us in Spanish, of course, and he wrote a large apocalyptic book called The Coming of the Messiah in Glory and Majesty. Now, an Englishman by the name of Edward Irving got hold of the Spanish book and he translated it into English. And it's interesting that it's his church in England where speaking in tongues began. And J.N. Darby took this doctrine from Lacunza, from the Jesuits. He took that doctrine and modernised it, and it's been accepted by Christianity pretty well across the board. If you've got any Baptist friends or Pentecostal friends, you will pretty well be assured that they believe in dispensationalism and the secret rapture. pretty well 100%, right across the board. And but the devil realised, well, if we're going to have a message, it needs to be vibrant and alive. So this was the beginning of the tongues movement, and also in the year 1844, the rappings started in a place in New York. And 4 years later, in the year 1848, the Fox sisters, heard of the Fox sisters? They were the originators, really, of what we call modern spiritualism today. And it originated there in around about the year 1844. I meet some people, you know, who try to say to me, well, 1844 is a non-event. Have you ever heard that? People say, what do you get? Well, 1844 is a non-event. Listen, God doesn't believe it's a non-event. That's why he's given us the prophecy in Daniel 8. And I'll tell you someone else who doesn't believe it's a non-event. Who's that? The devil, because it's in that very year the devil has brought all these counterfeits. And each counterfeit appeals to a different group of people. And so he wants the whole world under his grip. It doesn't matter what they believe as long as it's not following what God has asked us to believe. And it all originated in 1844. In the middle of the 1800s, there was another diversion that was going to trap many Christians. Ever heard of Joseph Smith? What's Joseph Smith known for? The beginnings of the Mormon Church. And he was assassinated. You can see the drawing there of his assassination in 1844. And they teach, the Mormon Church teaches, that we are divine and we are of the order of Melchizedek. That's what they believe. And as I said, on June 27, 1844, he was murdered. And once again, we have an ideology which is a counterfeit of God's truth. And if you know anything about the Mormon Church, you will know that they have some similarities with Seventh-day Adventism. They believe in the first angel, because on top of their temples they've always got an angel with a trumpet. And they quote Revelation 14, 6 and 7. They have a partial health message. Once again, a counterfeit of God's message for these last days. Then you have a spiritualistic secret society called Delta Kappa Epsilon. And this arose in the year 1844. They have 56 chapters in both North America and in Canada. Then you have the Baha'i faith. It arose in Iran. And it grew out of a branch of the Shiites in Iran. And this faith was proclaimed by a young Iranian that he called himself the Bab. And he taught that God had different prophets. He had Moses, then he had Jesus Christ, he had Muhammad, and then he's got the Bab, the Baha'is. And if you go and have a look and do any research at all on the subject of Baha'is, you'll notice that they arose, do you know in what year? 1844. The very year that God's message arose. 1844. And then around about 1844, that's when the feminist movement arose. It's when the ecumenical movement arose. All around 1844, that very year. And these movements that the devil raised up to circumvent, to discourage and to divert people's attention from the truth. And God had raised up a movement in 1844, and the devil was going to make sure that no one accepted it. Now, in 1844, I want to go back to the year 1844, a Seventh-day Baptist lady by the name of Rachel Oakes. There she is. I don't know whether she'd be happy about that picture, but Nevertheless, that's the one we've got of Rachel Oakes. Now, she was a Seventh-day Baptist. And she came across a Millerite preacher by the name of Frederick Wheeler. Now, Frederick Wheeler, as I said, believed in the second advent. He was a Millerite. And she said to him one day, "What about the commandments?" And Frederick Wheeler he was quite upset by the whole thing, but he began to study it. He was honest, and he began to look into it. And he accepted the Sabbath truth in the year 1844. And so the Sabbath was restored and established again in 1844. Then, in 1844, a man by the name of Charles Fitch. Now, Charles Fitch believed and discovered soul sleep. Because up until this stage, all these people believed that you go to heaven when you die. But as a result of Charles Fitch's study, he brought to the attention of the world the fact that when we die, we sleep until Jesus returns. And then in 1840, we find the emergence of the spirit of prophecy. I mean, it's amazing. God's church has to have the spirit of prophecy. If the spirit of prophecy is not existent in the church is not God's church. The spirit of prophecy is vital, and it's foundational to the Adventist church. And I've often thought, I tell you this, if it wasn't for the spirit of prophecy, our church would not be existing today. It would have been so racked by division that it just would have disintegrated. But it's the spirit of prophecy that has held the church together to help make sure our understanding of the Bible is correct. And sometimes people say to me, "Do you think there's going to be another Ellen White, another spirit of prophecy?" I don't believe so, and I'll tell you why I don't believe that God is going to raise up another one. Because first of all, we haven't followed all that's been given to us anyway, have we? We're a long way short of that. So why would God give us more information when we're not even following the information that God's given to us? That would be one reason, but the main reason I would say that's not going to happen is because if you go back to the type, and the study of typology is wonderful. You know what I mean by typology? For example, the lamb is a type of whom? Christ. That's what we mean by type and antitype. The type is the lamb, the antitype is Jesus. And the Advent movement is the antitype of the Exodus movement. Because the parallels between the Exodus movement and the Adventist movement is absolute, completely, 100%. All the doctrines that we believe today were in the Exodus movement. Health reform, dress reform, all of them, every last one of them, they had. And it's an interesting study, and sometime, if we had time, I'd like to go through with you and compare the two movements. Because it's a mirror image all the way through. And that movement was a one-prophet movement, is that right? By a prophet, the Lord led Israel out by Moses, and by a prophet, he was preserved. Moses died just before the movement entered the promised land. And the prophet died just before we have entered the promised land. And Moses was resurrected, no doubt because he was a type of Christ 3 days after he died. It says that, remember, the devil contended about the body of Moses because the devil was saying to God, "You can't take him. He's a sinner." And God had to contend with him and show that Moses had been forgiven. And no doubt he was resurrected 3 days later, and in a special resurrection. And we are told that there's going to be, according to Daniel chapter 12, there's going to be a special resurrection. 2 groups of people are going to be raised to see Jesus come. Who are the 2 groups? Who are the 2 groups that are going to be raised to see Jesus come? There are those who pierced him. And who was the other group? Those who preached and were faithful in the early Advent message. You know, one of the most wonderful stories is for any person to read about our pioneers. I stand in great humility when I read what they went through, what they stood for, what they put up with, the little that they had. And I often say to myself, how can we stand alongside that type of commitment today? We have it so easy. You know, if it gets a bit cold, oh, it's too cold to go to church today. Or if it's a bit wet, it's too wet to go to church today. Or it's a bit inconvenient. They preach too long. I tell you, God would be disgusted with us. And that group of faithful men and women are going to have the privilege of being raised to see Jesus come. And then following that will be the main resurrection of when Jesus comes back. What a wonderful day that will be when he returns. And so Moses had a health message too, didn't he? Is that right? The health message, the same as we have a health message. And God has given to us the health message so that we will be faithful and be able to be a witness to God. That's why God's given us the health message. And of all people in the world, and I know many of us are very faithful when it comes to the health message. And furthermore, we live longer. I mean, there's so many studies about Seventh-day Adventists. I often tell folk when I'm studying with them or they're coming to my meetings, I say to them, you know, there's a good reason why you ought to become a Seventh-day Adventist, and that's you're going to live longer. It's true. And if you go down to our retirement village down here at Kings Langley, Oh, no, not Kings Langley, Sydney. Rossmoyne, yes. Many of the folk there are nearing 100. Here's Tony Page, who I've worked with over the years. How old are you, Tony, now? 92?
How old do you think I am?
You can see he's been a coal potter. He knows how to reply.
I'm 91, this November the 6th.
91, yes. And here he is sitting up, listening to every word. I rang him the other day when I got here because Tony, I just have so much respect for Tony. And when we were here back in 1978, many of the folk that were baptised in the Wanneroo Church and now Clarkson and so forth, that's where they came from Tony's faithful work knocking on doors. And there have been many others, so I have tremendous respect for him. Just wish he could live a bit longer. We're not wishing you dead, Tony, but we want you to live a lot longer and be faithful as you are. And of course, these people, these folk in 1844, they had a deep conviction that God had raised them up to preach to every nation, kindred, tongue and people. But they had nothing to be able to do it. I mean, you put your mind back to 1844. All the discoveries pretty well that we take for granted didn't exist. And in that very year, 1844, God wasn't caught by a surprise, because he had been working on a man's mind and made an amazing discovery. right in 1844, and the discovery that he made, well, by the way, his name was Samuel Morse. Who's Samuel Morse? What did he discover? Morse code. In the very year 1844. And he stood over there in the Congress in Washington, D.C., and he had his friend, Vail, go down to Baltimore, which is a few miles away. And he typed out on his machine. And Vail then typed it back, the same message back. And he typed the message back. And do you know what he said? What message do you think that Samuel Morse typed? Yeah, you're very close. What hath God wrought? Very first words. And Samuel Morse was a far greater student of the Bible than he was of Morse code. He was far more interested in the Bible. He was a great student of Daniel and Revelation. He loved the Bible. And God used him to open up the opportunity of taking the message to every nation, kindred, tongue, and people. And I believe that's why God has allowed us to discover the things that we have discovered. Of course, the devil is using those very things. But we can also use them. That's why we use television and we use the internet and we upload, trying to fill the world with God's truth. And it's just amazing to me how many people, over in New Zealand, I don't know whether there's any New Zealanders here, but they have a television program called First Light over in New Zealand. I discovered it one day. I went to New Zealand and I was in the motel, and when you just arrived, I thought, oh, I'll just see what's going on. Turned the television on, and I was flicking around, and I listened. I thought, well, that sounds like Adventism. I listened a bit more, and I found out this was First Light. I'd never heard of it before. And they tell me in New Zealand that just about every Sabbath, there are new people who are walking into church just off the street. Is that right, Mark?
29 people a week walking into the church.
29. A week. And I tell you, First Light doesn't mix the message. No soft way with First Light. They tell it as it is. They're putting the message on here. These messages are going to be beamed on First Light. See, God has honest people everywhere, and today we've got to give the message a certain sound, and God will bring people in contact with us. And this all happened. By the way, in 1844 was the first steam train, the Xenia Railway. Let me just read you some interesting things that happened in 1844 that I haven't mentioned so far. The decade of the 1840s was probably the most important decade of the 1800s. Probably more discoveries were made in 1840 than have ever been made since in that decade. This is when ocean-going steam trains came about. This is when the electric telegraph, as we said, was discovered. This is when they discovered penny post. Now, I don't know whether you've heard about the penny post, but up until 1844, the idea of having someone deliver letters to your letterbox was just unheard of. And you couldn't afford it anyway. You imagine trying to take a letter from Perth to Sydney, say. Impossible. But in 1844, they discovered in England what is called the penny post, because to buy a stamp cost 1 penny. And it opened up now the postal service for everybody. Even the very poorest person could afford the penny post. That all happened in 1844. This is when photography, negative photography, was discovered. You know, things that we take for granted. By the way, this is when sanitation was discovered in England. I don't know whether you're too horrified, but let me just tell you one or two things. When I was over in Edinburgh, you can still go there today, in the Royal Mile, just down from, you know where they have the tattoo every year, the castle? What is it called? The Edinburgh Tattoo, yes. And it's just near there, within stone's throw, literally. And I was just walking down from the castle and I saw this little museum. And I noticed that there was a pig out the front door, not a live one, but I don't know what it was made of. It was a statue, but I don't know what it was made of. It was at the front door and it had a museum. And I thought, well, I wandered in. And what they had done is they had reconstructed life in that shop or in that museum as it was lived in the 1840s and before. Right in the middle of the landing was a potty, because they didn't have sewerage back in those days. And I noticed as I came in these shoes that were hanging on the wall, and they had big risers so that the shoes on the surface, on the top, looked like our shoes, but underneath they were raised up. Now I soon found out why they needed to be raised up, because at midnight what they would do with the potty, they didn't have somewhere to put it down the toilet or anything, they would take it, and you can imagine they've been using it all day, and then they would just tip it out the window over the street. That's why you didn't wander the streets after midnight or anywhere near midnight. They just tipped it out, and then that's where the pig came in. The purpose of the pig was to help clean it up as much as you could, because every house had a pig. And then, of course, they probably didn't clean it all up, and that's why you had risers on your feet as you walk down the street. Now, sanitation, as we understand it, wasn't discovered until 1844. Amazing. You know, when the Daniel 12 says, in the time of the end, knowledge shall be increased. That's not just referring to knowledge of Daniel's book. It's referring to literally, that's when there was an explosion in literal knowledge. It took place at the very time when God raised up his message in these last days. And so we can be very, very confident that God has a message. And what the tragedy of all tragedies is, when we're seeing what we're seeing happening around us today, and a person would have to be blind and stupid not to realize that the world today is very different to what it was just a few years ago. Is that right? And who knows what's going to happen in the next 12 months. I think some of us are going to get a real shock, because the worst is still to come. And even the government now is talking about inflation, and we all know what inflation does to your money. Those of us living on a super or anything like that, it's just eating away at your savings and the values. And who knows, we may have another COVID-19 coming. Who knows? I don't know that. And the government is certainly making preparations. I heard where your Premier here, just yesterday was it, or the other day, is passed some laws that he's going to make it very easy to do what he did before again. Who knows? But at the very time when God's message has so much evidence for it, we have many of our members who are wonky, who are unsure, who are not in earnest, who get along to church perhaps once now and might see them in another month's time. What's wrong with us? This is the time when we need to be meeting together. This is the time when we need to be in earnest, because Jesus is coming. He couldn't make it more plain to us than what he's doing now, giving us a little time to get in line, because when it comes, it's going to be too late. And yet, we have too many of our members who are too sleepy. And I just think it's a tragedy. We all need to take note of where we are. Listen to this statement, as Spirit of Prophecy, as the Lord's people show their determination to follow the light that has been given, the enemy brings all the powers to bear to discourage them. But they are not to give up because of the difficulties that arise when they try to follow the counsels of the Lord. And we can expect a lot more winds of doctrine to blow soon. A lot more. And God is calling for us today to be faithful to his message. And to get behind the church. Church is not perfect. I know that. And you know it. Not all our leaders are converted. But despite that, this is still God's church. And the church is going through, we're told, in spite of itself. It's going through. And I want to make sure that I'm part of that group that's going through. And I'm sure you do too. That's why you're here. May God help us as we study and think more about these things. Now, this afternoon, and I hope you'll be here at 2:30. That will be enough time to have our lunch. 2:30, we're going to study the investigative judgment, and then at 4 o'clock we're going to follow that with a baptism of a candidate that some of you will know, and Naomi Hanbury, and that's going to be a very, very wonderful time. She has members of her. Well, she'll tell you all about what she's been doing and where she's been. She was brought up in the church, but left the church for how long, Naomi? How many years? You were outside the church for 4 years? No. 40. You wouldn't think she was that old to look at her, but anyway. Did I say the right thing, Naomi? No, it's true. But God you're going to be greatly moved as you hear her story, because it is a wonderful story. And so that's our program this afternoon, all right? And by the way, tomorrow, if you're interested, I don't know whether there's going to be enough room, but tell me where it is, Mark. Chidlow Hall. Yes. You'll all know where Chidlow Hall is. I know the direction. But there's a little group. We're trying to form a little church plant up there. And in that hall on Sabbath is when the Adventist group meet. And then on Sunday, there's a Sunday keeping group meet. And they've allowed us, they want us to take the meetings for them tomorrow. And so I'm taking a couple of meetings, and I think there's going to be a cooking demonstration as well. And who knows where this is going to go, but when the Lord opens up opportunities, we jump in. Is that right? Yes, let's jump in and see what happens. But God's going to bless us. So that's our program this afternoon, so I hope you'll be here, and I think we're going to have a song. Sing together.